members. And for those of you who are new, and there are several of you, we have a new thing that we're doing, which means that we've invited you to put a blue dot on your card, because it's easy when you get people together that haven't seen each other for a long time that they talk to the familiar faces, and we want you to feel particularly welcome. So if you're members and you see somebody at lunch afterwards with a blue dot, please go up and welcome them, because it's your club. And any of us who have one of these on means that we're on the board, which means we do planning. And as you may not know, we do about, if you're new, we do about 2 events a year. You'll meet Roger Landry, who's involved in doing that. And we want to hear what you want. It's your club, it's our community, and we're very open to whatever. But you're not here to listen to me. I'm done, and I'm going to give it now to Roger Landry, who will do the welcoming to the speaker.
Thank you, Madam President. Did you say 2 events a year? Yeah. Because I was awfully busy for 2 events a year. Well, welcome to you all, as Denise said, members and those who are going to be members very soon, and guests, and those on the virtual aspect of it, down probably in Florida, everywhere. You are welcome. Hi, Iris. How are you? Iris is our VP for membership. I'm VP for events. So again, I welcome you. I think I understand why you're all here, and I'm very happy that one of our newest members, our speaker, had consented to do this talk today, which is, as you know, timely, important, the reason that you're here. You must have read her resume, because that's why you're here. But I just want to accentuate a few things. You know, she's the Paul F. McGuire Lecturer in Comparative Politics at the Kennedy School. And she's 30 years teaching at Harvard. And she is the most cited political scientist worldwide. Unbelievable, according to Google Scholar. A lot of calls, huh, there, Pippa? Yeah. And this one really gets me, because, you know, I sat down once and took me a year to write a book, and you wrote 50 books. And that's not even counting articles and everything and presentations and everything. So what do you do in your spare time there, Pippa?
Raise chickens, actually.
For those of you on the virtual side, go up to the right-hand corner of your screen and look at the mode and hit that and put speaker, so you'll be able to see Pippa. Make sure you're on mute as far as your voice goes. And I think that's about it. We will have a Q&A after. Pippa says she does welcome questions during the talk, but you know, I would say those that further the topic the point she's making right now. Otherwise, if you can wait till the end, it would be a little better. Okay. Madam President will bring you the mic. That's how she is. Wendy. Okay. Wendy there is a director of this museum, our host. Thank you so much for doing this for us. So this is our topic, and I don't want to hold it up anymore. I think I've said it all. Any questions before we begin? Let's do it. Pippa Norris, Dr. Pippa Norris.
I have my own mic. So it really is a pleasure to see you all here, even on a snowy and cold day. And I know that we're really here, not really because of me, but because of the topic. Everybody is so engaged in politics right now, and all the events which have been going on from the election through to the inauguration. And it's really a chance for all of us to get together and think about this, whether we celebrate or whether we commiserate on the developments which have been happening. And to put it in a broader context, so much of the commentary kind of comes at you like a fire hose, right? And you're reading articles in all the different papers and looking at podcasts, but really trying to stand back a little bit and think about this in comparative perspective and maybe in historical perspective, to understand what's going on in America in terms of many other countries around the world. So what I'd like to do is to give you a little bit from the book, which came out with my colleague, Ron Inglehart, who is also an incredibly well-known political scientist who unfortunately we lost a couple of years ago. And it's about cultural backlash. There are many explanations, and we'll go through 3 explanations about what's going on around the world, why it is that these parties and these leaders suddenly seem to have had a resurgence in so many diverse countries, from Scandinavia through Western Europe to the Mediterranean, to post-communist countries, to Latin America, and many other parts of Asia and so on. And obviously in this area, I can't go through the whole thing. Somebody, by the way, said, did I bring some copies to sell? Which I did not. That would be too Trumpist, if I can put it like that. Although maybe the book should be gold-plated as well for that one. But anyway, but I'll just give you a little soupçon. If anybody's interested, obviously it's available. And I'm going to ask 4 questions and structure the talk in this. Firstly, populism is a concept that we often think about in America historically. We go back to the 19th century. But in fact, the whole concept has changed over time. So I'll try and define what this phenomena is about and see if you agree that that really does capture what President Trump stands for. And I'll talk in particular about this word authoritarian populism. It's the 2 things together, which is really the interesting modern phenomena. Not just populism, but the way in which it's colored by certain values. I'll then give you a brief overview, a summary around the world, and particularly in Europe, on other authoritarian populist leaders and parties, and let us understand how they are rising, for example, in Germany, threatening to become the second or the first party in the next elections, which are going on right now, in France, where again, the National Rally is moving ahead, in Italy, where Meloni is in government, in Hungary, of course, with Viktor Orban, and then worldwide, many other countries. Think about, for example, Maduro in Venezuela, think about AMLO in Mexico. So we'll talk about these and then say, what do they have in common? I'll just give you a little snapshot of some evidence. At the Kennedy School, we love to have evidence-based science. I know economists never believe that political scientists have science, but we do. And so anything that's too technical, just ask, but I'll show you some maps and show you what's going on. And then ask this big question, which is the puzzle. America, after all, is the land of immigrants. It's the land which has been built on people coming from foreign shores. I myself, as you may tell from my accent, Anglo-American. And I came because of Harvard, but many people came for all sorts of different reasons. And yet, the party of the Republican Party has now become so anti-migrant. How can this be, and how can they get elected? The party of the Republican Party of George Bush, going back, was always the party of law and order. It was the party of strong police support. And yet we can see all sorts of ways in which, again, the courts and the judges and the legal process is being challenged in major ways. The Republican Party was the party also of internationalism. It was for strong defenses of democracy, human rights, and a strong America abroad, intervening and being part of both the United Nations, agencies like the World Health Organization, and NATO. And yet we can see that transactional relationships coming back, instead of having a sense of collaboration and commitment amongst the West, we see what's in it for America. So a nationalism and nativism is taking over. So how do we start to explain why many parties which seem to have this set of policies, this set of values, are rising, given all the other social changes which should in some ways lead in a more liberal direction? And the last thing I'm going to say is, does it matter? What are the consequences? Just show you a little bit from that. Now, it's a lot to summarize, I know, but let's go through a little bit and start with the first question, and let's work on the concepts. If we don't know what we're looking for, if we don't know what the nature of Trumpism is, we don't know how other parties share similar values, we can't really start to measure it, we can't start to compare it. So just have a look at the inaugural speech. And I know some of you avoided it, some of you heard clips. But this was something which I thought was worth just highlighting as a way of capturing some of the tenure of what he was saying. As we gather today, our government confronts a crisis of trust. For many years, a radical and corrupt establishment has extracted power and wealth from the citizens, while the pillars of our society lay broken and seemingly in complete disrepair. We now have a government that cannot even manage a simple crisis at home. And all of that is very much what he also said in his 2017 inauguration. if you remember when he talked about the crumbling factories and the way in which there were fundamental problems. And this is essentially the aspect which is populist. It's anti-establishment. It's saying that government is failing, the state is failing, our politicians are ineffective and corrupt, not legitimate, even though they might have been elected, even though they might have been appointed, even though they might be very qualified and experienced. They are not the ones who are actually working in the interests of, quote, the people. So that's the first set of claims. And then the other claim, which is throughout his speeches, and it's a campaign claim, which is very, very common as well. We have a catalogue of catastrophic events abroad and at home, by the way. It fails to protect our magnificent law-abiding American citizens, but provides sanctuary and protection for dangerous criminals, many from prisons and mental institutions, about which there is no evidence, that have illegally entered our country from all over the world. So yes, we can see that the leaders aren't working, and what we have to have is a threat which is facing an existential threat to America, to the people of America, to our security, to the risks that we face. And this claim is not accidental. And I selected this because it's exactly what this whole concept is about. Firstly, what is populist rhetoric? So some people say it's a set of ideas, it's an ideology like liberalism or socialism. And some people say it's a way of speaking. And any politician can adopt populist ideas. It's not simply confined to a narrow set. Populism is really about challenging the legitimate authority of those of the established elite. Now, who are the elite? Well, I'm afraid everybody who went to Harvard is probably part of the elite. Anybody who went to any of the Ivies, and by the way, Harvard is going to be a big target of this. It was in the past Congress, and it's going to continue to be. For example, exploring the tax basis of Harvard's resources. But it's also, of course, elected politicians. It's also, of course, other parties, opposition parties, government officials, the deep state, which is now being attacked. It's also, and also public service is being undermined in terms of security. A fundamental problem for the Kennedy School, we teach public service. We teach to get people into all of those jobs in central government, local government, federal government, NGOs, a variety of other things. And when that's being attacked, what are the career paths for our students and our leaders? It is also against intellectuals, scientists. For example, think about the attack on COVID science and on a number of other aspects of science, and experts. Who needs experts? The privileged, rich, and powerful can be attacked, not necessarily, despite the tech brothers sitting behind and the inauguration. Nevertheless, we can think about other populists who will attack very much those large, most affluent groups, and multinational corporations, the news media, of course, so long as it's not Fox, and judges, the courts, the impartiality of the courts. So all of those groups are going to be attacked by populists. And you can think of this like the pitchfork brigade. You know, that classic photo that we have from Americana, in which basically there's a discontent. And of course, you can say, if politicians are corrupt in some countries, if they are incompetent, as they are in many countries, what's the problem? And the other claim of populism is not just that the elite, the establishment doesn't work in your interests, but also that the only real power should lie, the legitimate power should lie with the people, the average people, the ordinary people, the people who turn up to MAGA rallies, clearly, many other groups as well. And so the idea is that populists is trying to transfer power directly to the people. In theory, that's the rhetoric, that's what they say they're going to do. But in practice, the problem is there are very few mechanisms, of course, to do that, right? You have things like referendum, you can have majorities in elections, but by and large, there aren't many ways for most people to take part directly in government decision-making. So in this area, are you against that? Not necessarily, depending on the context. If a politician is corrupt, if the institutions aren't working, we should be critical. If too many people have incredible extremes of wealth and income, of course we should be critical. And on this side, should the public have should citizens have a larger role in their government? Of course. So this rhetoric, you can think of, is actually something which is not necessarily something that you might want to criticize. But the problem is that it's a rhetoric. It's a form of speech. It's a way of appealing to the audience. It's a way of trying to get them on your side. And in practice, what you have to look at is not the words, but the actions. And There are many ways to try and work out what the politician is really about, what the populist is really about. And this is really quite difficult in many cases because often they're very open. They often engage in magical thinking. They make promises which are very open and vague. Make America great, doesn't actually tell us anything they're going to do, doesn't tell us anything about their actions. But in practice, what they do is they appeal to what is termed authoritarian values. And this goes right back in social psychology to the 1950s, people who were looking at the Second World War and people who supported Nazism and extreme movements in Mussolini, in Italy, and various other groups. And they said there are certain characteristics of some groups. And what these groups emphasize is three things. Authoritarian values emphasize security. That, in other words, we are under real risk. That everything is catastrophic. That there's insecurity and instability on the streets. And therefore, I myself should be fearful, should be worried, should be concerned. Conventionalism is the second idea and divides into us and them, outsiders and insiders. My group versus you, the other groups. And that can lead to all sorts of isms, as it were, whether it's against foreigners, whether it's against other minorities, ethnic, racial, whether it's about Islamophobia, of course, in Europe, which is resurgent, again, misogyny against women, and also, of course, homophobia against, in particular, transgender rights and the LGBTQ community in the broadest sense. And also, it can be anti-Semitism, which again has resurgent in many, many places, including, to some extent, on university campuses. So all of this says we have our enemy, we're under threat from certain groups. And how do you get over that? You can't empower the people to really be effective. You're going to be loyal to the group, and you're going to be loyal to your leader of the group, the strongman leader, who says, I alone can fix it. I alone can defend you. So if you have, for example, very strong religious beliefs, and you feel that the whole of those are being threatened by secularism, the decline of people going to church, the decline of people who are believers, then you might be hostile to those groups. And if the leader says, I speak for you, you can't speak in this broader forum, I'm going to defend your values, faith, patriotism, a sense of country and nationalism, then you can protect us against them. So this combination of three things is something which is really, I think, fueling a lot of those who support MAGA and a lot of those who support Republicans, but also those who will support the National Rally in France or the Alternative for Germany or any of the other movements around the world which have been taking on these characteristics. And you can understand it if you put yourselves in those shoes. If you understand that your values and your identity is under threat, and you really believe that, nobody respects your values. America has changed. America has changed radically in our lifetime. And our values have changed as well. And if you believe that your values are not being respected, they're not part of Hollywood, they're not part of the New York Times or the Washington Post, they're not part of the mainstream network television, they're not being reflected in Congress, then you say, okay, strongman leader who's going to protect and speak for me, that's how I'm going to identify. I'm going to be supporting them because they're going to be helping me. So all of this can be seen if we start to look at the priorities of the White House. And here, obviously, things are evolving very fast. One of the reasons I looked on my phone next just to check that nothing else had happened. It's a fire hose, and really working out what's going on is complicated. But I just looked at the website to see what's being promised. And you can do it yourself by going to the White House. It's always amazing to me, by the way, is immediately there's a change of administration, the whole website disappears and another one comes in its place. And these are the sort of things which are being prioritized according to the White House itself. And as you can see, it's bold actions to support our border. Well, there's no surprise there. But also all of the other policies on migration, catch and release, remain in Mexico, which will have all sorts of problems, particularly for those who are already on the waiting list and have been cut off from having that interview. Ending asylum for illegal border crossings, including, of course, refugees from many countries which have got tremendous violence around the world. America used to be at the advocacy of making sure there are international standards for refugees, very different to other forms of migrants, but nevertheless, cracking down on criminal sanctuaries, vetting and screening of aliens. There's a really interesting new executive order on that, and a whole variety of other things. So this is all about the threats, right? Just as we said in the authoritarian idea and how you're going to be worried about this. And the president The White House and the military, by the way, are going to be engaged in defending you against these threats. And here's a few more, and then we'll get on, draining the swamp. So you remember we said with populism, the elites are corrupt. So this is what they're saying. They're going to be doing a golden age for America. He does like gold. By reforming and improving the government bureaucracy, by which he means more partisan appointments, getting rid of those who are more experienced in State Department and in a variety of other departments of state, and getting rid of DEI, which of course is the major attack within government on attempts, and kicking out those staff as well, and many other changes to make, quote unquote, accountability for government bureaucrats, note, not for the presidency, not to try and make the legislature more accountable. Instead, it's for the bureaucrats, the state, who are not doing, following along with the executive, and ending the weaponization of government in the Justice Department. Who knows what's going to happen there? We'll have to see, et cetera, et cetera. So those two elements, I think, do really characterize Trump. Before I go on, any critique of what I've said? Does anybody want to challenge what I've put forward about how we can understand authoritarian populism and how we can understand the appeal of Trump? If not, it's okay. But yes, please, please. I always welcome a couple of good questions in between different things.
No, the only thing that I would like to hear more about is the economic aspects of what we're seeing. That certainly there are people out there who have legitimate complaints, or at least are not doing well in our current economy.
That's right. The inequalities of wealth and income are enormous and are getting worse. If you see what the tech brothers have really expanded there over the last 4 years. And there is an economic element, but what I'm going to show you is that, in fact, not every populist party, an authoritarian populist party, is on the left or the right on the economy. So some of them do believe in a free market, getting rid of tax regulations, clearly part of the old Republican Party, and trying to open up markets from regulations, for example, on fracking or on energy. Others, however, are much more on the left. They believe in a strong welfare state, and you can still be an authoritarian populist like that. And I'll give you a very, very clear example, which I always quote, Bernie Sanders. I regard as a populist, but very much one on the left, whereas many other populists, as we'll look at, are very much part of the right on the economy. So it cuts across the economy, and there's some good evidence for that. But it's this new difference between authoritarian values and liberal values, which I think is the big issue, the cultural issues, which are really dividing us and dividing the parties today. So I think when I teach this at Harvard, my students at first are always very anti-populist, of course, because they think of it in terms of all sorts of extremes. But when you put it like that, you can actually start to empathize a little bit, to stand in those shoes. If your identities are under threat, if your values are not being respected, if you feel that there are America emerging, which is not your America. America is changing rapidly, and somehow you've been left behind. And it's not an economic left behind, although that's part of it. It's a cultural left behind in those rural communities, in those with older generations, in the less educated, less college educated, in a variety of other sectors of the communities, people who have values, who they believe are under attack, and they want somebody who's going to support them. Well, what about when I say Trump is only one example, if you read the paper here, everything is about Trump, 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 Trump. It's really overwhelming. I saw the New York Times on the front page today said, Donald Trump's giving his first television interview. This was the headline. I thought, why on earth tell us that? I mean, is this new? Is this something which was unexpected? It hasn't even said anything, but somehow even having a television interview is news. So anyway, but I think if we look more broadly, what we can see is that there are many parties. He is only one, and indeed he's rather late to this trend. The first, of course, was Marine Le Pen, father, but many other parties in Europe. And here's a little snapshot. And this broader phenomena has really been going on, as I said, in the early 70s, and then it's expanded in the 90s, and it's expanded in the last 2 decades as well. One of the examples which I kicked off my book with was Brexit, 2016. And of course, that was seen as very influential. Nobody expected, when I say nobody, none of my friends expected that Britain, when I say we, it's always ambiguous, but nevertheless, that Britain would leave the European Union. I mean, why? What madness would this be? Instead of which, of course, under a very strong populist, Boris Johnson, he turned things around and just got that in. And then, of course, we all know what's happened. The rest is history as the UK declines into the North Sea. In Europe, in Western Europe, the pillars of the EU, the National Rally. And we know that Macron is very unpopular. The presidential elections are coming along. They've also got a younger, new leader in the assembly. And so a new prime minister as well is potentially there. And that, think about if it was in many elections in the past, Marine Le Pen, she moderated her appeal, but she's very much part of the National Front, or the National Rally as it's now called. And she is edging up in the polls, and she could easily just tip over, potentially, as she's come second in many other presidential elections. Maybe this is the one. Macron is getting on a bit. In Switzerland, the SVP has been in power for many years as part of the executive. In Austria, there's going to be a new populist president just coming in. They tried to keep them out, but they just couldn't get enough of a coalition. In the Netherlands, you think of the Netherlands as one of the most liberal countries in the world, right? That's where they smoke pot in the cafe you're going to. But also many other aspects are very liberal in the Netherlands, and yet the Dutch Party for Freedom, very anti-Islamic, is a very strong party, and so on. But also in Norway, in Sweden, in Denmark, in Finland, again, these are the most strong democracies around the world. These are the most liberal democracies. These are the smaller countries with very affluent economies, much more so than the average income in the United States, and with strong welfare states, cradle to grave. Pensions. You remember pensions? Some of you might still have them, but most people don't. And in all of these, we have a populist party. In Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, post-communist Europe, there were hopes in 1989 as the Berlin Wall came down that it moved immediately to democracy, elections, competition, instead of which what we can see is that there are many parties, many parties which have emerged, which have the same authoritarian populist appeals. And so obviously Hungary with Orban and Jobbik, Poland, law and justice in power for many years, for example, very strong on anti-abortion, very religious party, and now being displaced, but can come back in Slovenia and Slovakia and many other countries. In Mediterranean, Golden Dawn, a neo-Nazi party, which was really very extreme. In Italy, of course, Meloni, the Lega Nord and Brothers of Italy, and around the world, Erdogan in Turkey, Modi in India, in Argentina, thank you very much, my brain was freezing, and Maduro, and many other ones I could have mentioned. And all of these are leaders which, this picture was striking, I tweeted it because I just thought it was so amazing. 2024, this is the G7, 2020, last year. And look at all the question marks. Who's left? Meloni, with a rather strange pantsuit, but nevertheless. But also we can see that many of these leaders of the West, of the liberal establishment, of the international world order, are either left, Rishi Sunak, for example, for the United Kingdom, Joe Biden. We know that Macron, there's a question mark. Trudeau, of course, the bastion of liberalism in the West. Schultz, and the only ones who are left there are the re-elections of the European leaders, the president and the council. So a major change in such a short time. And all of these, again, are the parties which are nipping at their heels. I won't go into them, but I'm very happy to talk about any of them, of course. Even in the United Kingdom, where first past the post majoritarian elections make it very difficult for small parties to break through, there has now been a YouGov poll, which is a good pollster, who says that maybe Reform, which is Nigel Farage's latest party, might even be ahead of the Conservative Party, the party which has been in power for more than 100 years. And very much, of course, part of Brexit and so on. All the other parties, though, as we can see, have very similar values, and I'll demonstrate that. What else do they have in common? Well, they're all blonde somehow, but that seems to be a common characteristic. And then worldwide, I'll just again put these guys in front of you. And especially in a presidential system, as you can see, and we have Bolsonaro and Milei, who have both been termed the Trump of the tropics. But populism, of course, has a long, long history in Latin America. It goes back much further than even Europe. So all of these are the leaders, and here is what's been happening. This is from the Pew Center, and it's just a little snapshot to show you how they've been rising in power. Does it mean that they've got 50% of the vote? No. But let me show you. This is Italy. We have Forza Italia, and of course, a long history of populism. We have the Lega, the Five-Star Movement, the Brothers of Italy. They're a coalition. And as we can see, 58% of the vote, and Meloni as the prime minister. We can see in Hungary, of course, the two extreme parties, 54% of the vote, majority. And of course, Orban's been in power since 2010, 15 years. In Greece, a variety of parties, as I mentioned, Golden Dawn, but many others as well. In Belgium, we can see, sorry, in Poland, we can see the numbers going up. In France, and that goes up even further in the most recent poll. Spain has been lagging behind, the Mediterranean somewhat, but Vox is the new kid on the block. In Belgium, we've had a number of different parties. Some of them have been declared illegal, but nevertheless, a fifth of the vote. Sweden Democrats, a fifth of the vote. The Netherlands, 60%. Alternative 10, but the latest poll has them in second place in Germany. Which is, again, quite incredible given the history and the culture and all sorts of problems. In Britain, never very much, but nevertheless, as I said, the latest poll of reform is certainly moving up. So, and this is Germany. I wanted to show you this because this is happening next month, February. This is the federal elections for the Bundestag. And as we can see, this is the latest. And so Christian Democrats are on top, as they have been. Remember Angela Merkel. The SPD, who were the governing party, have dropped. And who's in second place? AFD. And there is a gap, but nevertheless, as we can see, they go up and down. But look at the difference between this 3-year period and where they are now. And these other parties, the Greens in particular, have really gone down. Everybody who cares about environmental politics knows that the German Greens are one of the strongest Green parties anywhere, but they've really been declining. Now, let me move on. I'm going to cut through some of these things because I think they're a bit too technical for everybody. I'm happy to go back. But let me just show you the map. Briefly, I wanted to find out what these parties stood for and what parties around the world, how many were authoritarian populists. So what I did was I carried out an expert survey, and this is worldwide, over 1,000 experts. We asked each of them, where would you place your parties on 21 different values? And so there were things which were measures of left or right on the economy, conservative social values like rights towards minorities, rights towards abortion, and liberal social values. And we can map where the parties are and just show you the parties which are up here, which are the authoritarian populists. This is the map. And I know it looks complicated. It really isn't, though, because a lot of you, because you've all been to Harvard, can understand all your numbers, of course. So this is left and right on the conventional sense, the question we had about the economy, right? And so we asked people can classify by their position on economic issues, such as privatization, taxes, regulation, and the welfare state. On the economic left, they want government to play a larger role. On the right, they want markets. Where would you place your parties? And then we have over here, liberal or conservative social values. So that's another question that we ask our experts. And that's the question about the social values. Parties can be classified by their current social values. Those with liberal values can be expected to support personal freedoms, abortion rights, same-sex marriage, and democratic participation. Those with conservative values reject that. So this up here are the authoritarian populists. In other words, they're socially conservative and they're economically on the right. As I said, most of the parties are really in that. And so we have parties like the Swiss People's Party, Vox in Spain. We have parties like the Alternative for Germany. We have parties in Ireland. We have parties in Japan. Look at the US Republican Party. This was in 2019, before Trump got the next nomination, et cetera, et cetera. Where are the other parties? Well, as you can see, they're mostly down here. So this is the liberal left. And you've got all sorts of Labour parties, social democratic parties, moderate centre-right parties. And where did the experts place the Democratic Party there. So they're very much got lots of other company around them, but nevertheless, they're there with parties in Estonia, in New Zealand, in the Netherlands, in Britain, like the Labour Party there, in the Czech Republic, etc., etc. Some parties are further to the left, but nevertheless, they're over here. So what we've got to work out is, why is it that these parties have been expanding their support? And why is it that all these other parties, Green parties, Labour parties, and so on, have been weakening and eroding their support? And what do we understand to be the consequences when you get such polarization in a two-party system? And so on. Here's the question. And I'd like, just before I answer it, I'm going to give you 3 core explanations. I'm going to ask all of you, when you think about this phenomena and what's changing in all these countries and in the United States, give me 2 or 3 explanations which you think are most plausible about why this is a phenomenon. And it can't just be about an individual leader, because it's bigger than that. It can't just be about something which is unique to a country, like a particular type of institution that doesn't exist elsewhere, or a particular way of organizing a campaign. There has to be some general explanations across all these countries that might be plausible. And then I'll give you a little bit about how we think about it with 3 ways of understanding this. Who'd like to kick off? And of course, but I always cold call, I'm afraid. So please, just here.
Is it because the media in many situations send out a message that people are deprived, they're undervalued, they're all of those things?
So it could well be the media. In particular, we always blame social media for misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is when you say something which you believe but is not right. Disinformation is when it's actually propaganda. And that's certainly a development. But when did the internet come into existence? When did social media start to take off? The mid-90s. 1995 was when you first got your internet browser, a visual Netscape. And so it has certainly changed our habits and our media habits, and the fragmentation of media might be part of it. But many of the countries that we saw, which have these strong parties, especially in Nordic countries, have very strong public service media as well. They have a very large public corporation, which is concerned with broadcasting, which is concerned with neutrality, which has regulations for balance, and which people are still watching in large numbers. So it could be the media, and it could be that we're in media bubbles, particularly when your media becomes highly partisan and you're only listening to one side or another in a two-party system. But if that's the case, then we need to say these are kind of beliefs that people aren't real. It's all to do with the manipulation that they're getting their information from. They're misinformed. They don't really understand what's going on, and they're getting the wrong thing. So that's one potential explanation. Another one that we might have.
Fundamentalist religion.
Explain a little bit more. Why would that be an important part?
I mean, people believe what they're told in church, if you will.
Right.
And I think some of the churches are sort of on the edge of doing what they're not supposed to do, and that's politics.
Yes, and Christian nationalism in America. The phenomena whereby the church said we need to overcome the divisions between church and state and so on. And again, that might be plausible. Many of the movements who are supporting Donald Trump are certainly highly religious and evangelical. And yet, remember those countries which I mentioned? There are a whole lot of countries in Europe which are very, very secular. If you ask how many people go to church on a weekly basis, this is another book I did write actually on sacred and secular, in places like Norway and Sweden, it's 3%. In Britain, it's 5%, and they're very old. They're kind of, it is emptying pews. Everybody's secular. So, yes, if you feel religious and you feel that your values aren't being reflected in the society, that could certainly make you feel I need a strong. Yes.
Yeah, maybe religious fervor instead of going into.
Oh yeah, they're going to that. They change their identity.
And I remind the group that you can't speak without the mic because the people can't hear you.
Yes. So the question is it because you lose your identity for religion that you get another form of identity? And identity politics, when it's tied up with partisanship, is very important. And in particular, when it's negative partisanship, we have a concept called affective polarization. What that means is not so much you really are in favor of your party, you hate the other side. And particularly if you're in a two-party system, that's a fundamental problem because, it's us, them. It reinforces that us-them cleavage that we have. In many multi-party systems, it's much more complex. You have 13, 15 parties to choose on the ballots, then not only is there less incentive to hate the other party, but also you just switch around a bit more. So partisanship can be somewhat weaker. But it could be another explanation. What else, please? Oh, yes, you're the chair for the question.
In terms of a fundamental psychological need for a hierarchical structure, which both is reassuring and allows you to abandon your own participation.
Yes. Well, that's exactly the essence of the authoritarian values. You want somebody else to defend you. You want basically, you remember one of our, which politician was it said, Trump is daddy. I can't remember who it was. No, it wasn't Trump, actually. It was one of his acolytes, somebody who was hoping for a cabinet job or something like that. He called him daddy in public on television. I can't believe it. But that's exactly the idea. They're going to defend you. But the question then has to be, why now? Why would this suddenly become value which is important? Why is it that people suddenly start, after all, this is a fairly modern phenomenon in its broadest sense, in terms of a mass movement with so many people, a fifth or a half of the population in some countries. So yes, the psychological explanation is plausible for individuals, but how does it explain changes over time in America? So let's see what else. It might be an explanation. Let's think.
But the past is not past because the authoritarianism of Argentina and Peronism is a different history and legacy,
Yes.
say, of Modi's India with the Hindu Islamic tensions, or the U.S. with the legacies of slavery and racism.
Absolutely. And so that partly unpacks that these are not new parties, they're very old parties in many ways. We're going in a cycle back to some of the earlier traditions. And for example, the BJP in India, Modi, it's very much about nationalism and Hinduism, and a way of trying to suppress some of the Muslim minorities in that country, which of course is a long tradition in India. Similarly, in many other countries, you can see certain ethnic minorities who are targeted, anti-Semitism. I mean, the classic, and it's coming back. But that's the me. Why, in 2024, would these concepts come back to be popular? Why on earth is anti-Semitism being lost at the end of the Second World War, that we understood what that problem was? Why would educated, affluent Scandinavians, French, German citizens, vote for a party that was anti-Semitic or Islamophobic or against other minorities from other countries or against refugees or asylum seekers? Why now? So we still need to say, yes, these are historical things, but why do they come in and out of fashion? Other suggestions, please.
I'd like to reinforce the view that different countries might have different forces that are leading to it. I think that's partially an explanation for why the numbers in Scandinavia, even though you point them out, were still 10 to 15%, whereas the numbers in Italy are a majority, Hungary majority, France near majority,
Yes.
Germany's creeping up. So I think there's different forces, but I think they're all, honestly, I think they're based on fear, the promotion of fear, and I think it's been a deliberate policy for 20 years. It's taken a long time for these countries to get to this state. It isn't like someone just came along yesterday and all of a sudden went from 2% to 52%.
Yes.
So there's been lying and propaganda, I will argue, in a lot of these countries for a very long time promoting fear. One of the most telling polls that I recall, I don't remember exactly what year it was, but I think it was fairly recently, where people said, what do you think about the economy? Oh, it's doing terribly. How are you doing? I'm doing fine. So people were believing the stories that other people were having all these problems, but they themselves were actually better off. So to me, it's propaganda and fear is the common theme, but the different sources there are different sources in different countries.
And I think that's particularly true on economic perceptions, that they're very much filtered by partisanship. And we've seen that immediately after the election, when you ask the American public, how's the economy doing? Republicans suddenly say, it's great. You know, like one day after Trump gets into office, and then the Democrats say, oh, it's dreadful. We're going to get higher inflation, et cetera, et cetera. So misinformation or perception filtered through partisanship is very important. And the other point you make is institutions are important as to whether you get into power. So in particular, for example, if you have a threshold in the election, you have to have 4% plus of the votes. It means that small parties have real problems in breaking through. Once they get past that, over time, they get a platform, they get representation, they can sometimes increase their numbers to become part of a coalition, they get ministers into office, and that means, and they can even become presidents or prime ministers in some cases. So institutions really matter as to the electoral success of these parties. And again, if you did not have the Electoral College in America, we'd have had a very different situation. The last election, 2024, was won by 1.5% of the vote, as the difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And basically, that's 2 million votes across the population, which is 300 million. So it's a small difference in the electoral system. And for example, which states are actually the swing states can make a tremendous difference to who gets into power in a closely fought contest. So Germany has different institutions to Sweden, which has different institutions to Italy, which has different institutions to America, et cetera, et cetera. So institutions absolutely matter. They're contextual, but they're not entirely unpredictable. I think you can filter those into your models and still start to explain it. A couple more, and then I'll give you my 3 explanations. We'll see if we've got them. Yes. Oh, one more.
So you just started to get into what I was going to bring up, and you mentioned the Electoral College.
Yes.
The other thing is ranked choice voting.
Oh, yes.
So many of these countries, and now ours too, is multi-party. We don't realize it here,
Yeah.
but when Trump ran, I don't know, the first time, there were 14 people running for the Republican nomination
Right.
for president, and you know, you can win with 10% of the vote.
That's right. And it's not simply the Electoral College and the swing states, which are so confined. So nobody ever campaigns in Massachusetts for the federal government, as you know. But it's also the way in which there are other institutions which are really reinforcing that. And my colleagues, Steve Levitsky and Daniel Zinbat at Harvard, have written a really good book. It's all about the way in which the US system really empowers minorities, which are unfair. The Senate is another example, overrepresenting rural areas versus urban areas for historical reasons and other constitutional ways of doing things as well. So most countries don't have 2-party systems. Nobody, basically. Even Britain has about 14 parties in parliament nowadays, and many on the ballot in most constituencies. So you get choice. When I filled out my Massachusetts ballot, I was shocked. So many offices only had Democrat. There was no choice, right? And you think this is meant to be a competitive democracy. Why are people not running? Why are people not fighting? And because of gerrymandering and because of the ways that we have districts and a variety of, because of the money in politics, because of the difficulties of buying media, all of those things contribute to a lack of, so the institutions matter, absolutely. And by the way, the institutions you can also change. So that's an important lesson. If you can mobilize, I don't actually believe in ranked choice voting in single member districts. I believe in it in multi-member districts, but I really believe in mixed systems, which you have, like in Germany, some member districts and some proportional districts. Combine the two and you get the best of all possible worlds in some ways. I won't go, sorry, Nikki, I haven't really explained it very well, but I'll go into that later if we're interested in, I don't suppose you are, the technicality of the details. One more explanation and then I'll tell you my 3. And nobody's yet mentioned my cultural backlash, which is, so nobody's read the book, which is interesting. You haven't done your homework, but you can do it afterwards, so that's okay.
I have a 2-part question. One being Citizens United and the effect of
Money,
ridiculous amounts of money hidden from the American public.
That's right.
And
It's
2,
shocking.
the education of the American voter and how much they understand about civics. And I mean, I was shocked to hear a statistic that 47% of all of Americans can't name one branch of government.
Yeah.
Or 37 and
all
40
sorts of-
can't name all 3.
Yes. The only good news about that is that political knowledge hasn't decreased over time. It hasn't increased, but it hasn't decreased. And if you're active, as I say in some of my other work, you can get immense amount of information about anything. If you're uninterested, you're turned off. you're just apathetic, you're doing lots of other things, you're busy, then of course it's quite difficult to find out what's happening in American politics, much more so than in many other countries. Again, if I take the British example, you turn on the beat, as many other public broadcasters, and you get the politics, and during an election it's balanced, every party has to be represented, and then you get basically a kind of an overview. And you always, in every discussion, have one party versus the other parties. They all talk to each other. Here, if you get into media bubbles, particularly in television and cable, and now in podcasts and in other internet sources, then it's very easy only to be in a hall of mirrors and not even to understand, not even to listen, not even to have a shared reality with colleagues who are in a very different. And by the way, I'm not simply talking about them and us, I'm talking about all of us. Part of our work in the Kennedy School right now is to try and build constructive dialogues and to make sure people can listen to the other side and understand the other side much better. And it's really difficult to do because we're all in our own sense of reality and we don't want to listen to the other side and to even believe in it. But I always believe you have to challenge that if you can and get people to think, if you were really a MAGA supporter, what would that be? What's going on there? It's not simply ignorance. It's not simply lack of information. Some of them are going to rally after rally. There's something there we have to understand. If we don't understand it, then you cannot respond to it. You cannot counter it. And that's part of the problem, I believe, with the Democratic Party and why they lost in 2024. Well, look, let me give you 3 explanations. And again, each one is one which you've heard. So it's not that these are totally unknown, but they do have some historical roots, and let's unpack them. First one, economic grievances. Nobody mentioned that today, which is interesting. It goes right back to other colleagues at Harvard from the 50s. I don't suppose anybody here was taught by Lipset or Bell, were they? No, they're great names in intellectuals, political scientists, and really leading. I was once sitting, when I was first arrived here in the 90s, at a dinner. You know how you have dinners with alumni all the time, and sitting there, and next to me was Daniel Bell. I couldn't believe it. It was like sitting next to, Taylor Swift or something. It was for me. Anyway, that's a little aside. So they were looking at all the different issues going on in the 1940s and 50s and the 30s. Fascism, Poujadism, McCarthyism in the United States. Remember the anti-communist intolerance of that. And what they said at the time was it wasn't the lowest income and it wasn't the richest, it was the group in the middle, the petty bourgeoisie, as they term them, the self-employed, who felt that they were being squeezed in the of organized labor, the large manufacturing industry, and by also corporations and the affluent and those who were well off. And therefore they were stuck in the middle, and they were the ones who would support these types of extremist movements. Today, however, few people refer specifically, but you get all the time economic grievance argument. What is it? Globalized markets. And by the way, Danny Roderick in the Kennedy School also has advocated for this. Globalized markets mean manufacturing industry in America has been decimated, and that therefore the Rust Belt areas and all of those communities who depended on those factories for jobs were lost. And those communities find that their kids have to go to other areas, normally urban areas, to go to college. That's where nearly all the best universities are. And therefore the population declines. And what you get is a group who is basically benefit dependent, low income, lack of security, particularly really fundamental in America without the welfare that you'll get in many other countries. And also the disparities of income and wealth. The Piketty argument is one which basically leads to economic grievances. We should find that those who are supporting Donald Trump and other parties of their ilk should be those who are economically marginalized, right? All of these indicators should be there in the survey. Unskilled workers, blue-collar workers, lacking college degrees, unemployed, living in inner cities as the poorest areas, welfare dependent, and the precariat, as some people talk about them, who are economically insecure. And we can look at countries, we can look at regions in countries, you can look at a Michigan versus a growth area, like some of the areas with high tech. You could look at the variations across those who are more affluent countries versus poorer countries, trends over time of economic inequality, and is that related to populism? You can look at trends over a financial crisis. Is it the case that populism increases with the financial crisis in 2008 and then decreases as things get better? And we can look at it by individual attitudes towards the economy. Why might this be problematic? Well, we do find that where there's manufacturing industry in America that's declined, certain areas of the country, particularly where there's been high levels of Chinese imports of manufactured goods, those are the areas which often do have high levels of support, and they're often rural areas, and they're often older communities, and they're often religious communities as well. Those do have high levels of support for example, Donald Trump and the Republicans, but also we find this in many other countries. If you look, for example, at the AfD in Germany, the Ruhr and areas of Eastern Germany are very different to the more affluent areas of Berlin. Bidenomics. Think about what the achievements were of Bidenomics, as well as the limits and restrictions. Was it a particularly economically bad time? What was the level of jobs in terms of inflation and accumulated prices of living standards? It was. That's the major weakness, partly fueled, I'd argue, by Biden administration policies. The success of the first 2 years of spending was over capacity with the supply. But on other aspects, was it a really bad time if you were, for example, black looking for work? No, it was actually very low unemployment. Was it a bad time in terms of growth? In terms of most of our OECD competitors, it was a really good level of growth compared with those. If we think about gas prices, what's the average right now? Is that high? No. No. Especially if you take into account actual inflation rates and things like that. So there are many aspects of the economy that are doing very well nationally. And if we look at individual evidence, is it in fact that it's the lowest income, it's the blue collar workers, the factory workers of the past, the manufacturing industry who are supporting Donald Trump? Is there evidence for that? Look at their backgrounds, all of those who were arrested after it. What was their backgrounds? Were they the lowest income sectors of society? Were they? Policemen, teachers, all sorts of professions, firemen, ex-army, ex-military. There are whole things of very much male, by the way, versus female. But nevertheless, when I look at the individual evidence on economic grievances, in affluent Sweden, which has a very egalitarian, have you seen the tax rate in Sweden? If you ever complain about your taxes, go to Sweden, and it's 60% on many incomes. It's only got a couple of brackets. It doesn't have that many. I mean, it all disappears. You get a big packet. And in many other countries as well, which have been very egalitarian, as well as those which are highly unequal, you similarly find these parties. You similarly find this surge in support. Women is a big change, but women have benefited in certain ways in the economy, even though there's certainly still female poverty in major ways and female inequality. Yes, it does. And that's where I bring in my third argument, which I'm going to give you. Right, let me just give you the second argument. Second argument, which is very common in all the literature, it's all about others, outsiders, and the ethnicity and the way in which it's framed might be very different. Race in America is a very weird concept to most Europeans who think about ethnicity in a variety of other ways. They think about ethnic religion, ethnic nationalism, country of origin. They do think about race, but nevertheless, it's a different pattern. But nevertheless, the argument here, long-term process of globalization, open borders. And they open borders, for example, very much in the EU, because within the European Union, once you land and you get access, you get a job, then you can move around. But also in many other countries, high levels of population mobility, exacerbated now, of course, not just by poverty in Africa, but also by climate change and exiles from natural problems. Patterns of migration have expanded and they've increased racial diversity. So if that's the case, then we can look again at the evidence. Is it the case that when the refugee crisis hit in 2016, there was a sudden spike in support for these parties? And when the crisis went down, there was less of that? Is it the case again that it was interacting with jobs and the idea that outside jobs? And is it the case that it's linked to a whole bunch of social movements? Like, is it a reaction to Obama of 2012? Is it a reaction to Black Lives Matter? You know how we talk about kind of reaction and counter-reaction. Is that what's going on in race? And was race the heart of what was going on with Trump? minorities and too many migrants, then they believe that therefore AP parties, authoritarian parties, should be able to take that issue as their own. It's their issue ownership. And we can look at trends over time and we can look at areas, etc. How would you criticize this argument? Is race the heart of Trump's appeal? Is the challenge of migration the issue which most Americans care about and most of those who supported Trump in the last election really voted for? The 2024 election, where did Trump make some gains in terms of these issues? Immigrants, Hispanics, who felt that they'd come here legally. They were often fairly socially conservative, and they felt that they were being threatened by people who were coming across who did not have that go through that long that long process, which, by the way, I went through at City Hall years ago. So they made gains amongst that. What about Black Americans? And again, Trump made some gains there. Now, of course, the majority of Black Americans and the majority of Hispanics are still voting for Democrats because that's been their solid constituency. But you know, it used to be 90% of Blacks would vote for Democrats, and that has gone down under Trump. Under Trump. So racist, and that's how they get their support. How do they get their support from these minorities? I think we have to finish off sometime next time. Oh. Then I'll sit down and have Q&A. Please.
Fairness.
Yes.
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 Basic fairness.
Yes. Basic fairness.
Basic.
Related to race and
I think it
ethnicity.
crosses.
And I don't think decision-making is binary. It isn't one issue that necessarily drives a voter.
Yes.
And the precarity cuts across cultural values as well as economic values.
Yes. We need to work out how to order them in priority. But let's emphasize that when we're thinking about these things, it can be general ideas of social tolerance. It can be racial resentment, which is that other groups are getting on more than you are. You're stuck and you're not better off than your parents were. And it can be other links to authoritarian values, which is a trigger, it's part of a kind of package. So there's some evidence that maybe race is really critical, particularly in America, but across the countries, it's complicated. And again, Brexit, by the way, that wasn't about race. Migrants from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, who were the main groups who came across in the 50s, none of it was about that. It was against French people. French people. I mean, I have my problem with French people, but nevertheless, they're white Christian Europeans, same as other groups who are the target in Brexit, like Poles. Poles are Catholics, and they're white, and they're entrepreneurs. They were setting up small businesses. So the idea of ethnicity and race everywhere being the same as it is, and it's all the one thing to blame, is a problem, I think, in a number of different cases. People were anti-Europe. They weren't necessarily racist in that particular claim. So I'll just give you my explanation, and then I'll sit down and we'll have a more broader set of comments. We've got to sort these things out for the puzzle, and then we've got to work out essentially what we do about it as well. So here's the argument. And I'm building it very much on Ron Inglehart's work. As I said, one of my colleagues, sociologist, who started the work. Now, his first claim is the silent revolution. And so we don't just look at what happened in the current elections. We don't just look at we don't just look at what happened under Obama in 2012. We go right back to the 60s. And his core argument was that the 60s and 70s, amongst the younger and highly educated generations, saw a tremendous value change in Western affluent countries. So we saw all sorts of new social movements. We saw the rise of climate change. We saw anti-nuclear movements. We saw the women's movement, the second wave. We saw changes in LGBTQ organizations and rights, and a variety of other groups who were there. And as a result, amongst that generation and amongst that cohort, we had much more tolerance of different and diverse forms of sexuality, not binary, but much more fluid, and more self-identified gender forms. Again, not just men and women, but a variety of ways of understanding gender as an saw same-sex marriage, again, something which could never have been discussed in earlier eras, suddenly was becoming much more accepted. We saw changes in secularization, the decline of religion in this period. We saw cosmopolitanism, by which I mean people wanted to travel abroad, they wanted to live abroad, they wanted to be able to work and live and collaborate with other countries. The whole European Union is about cosmopolitan values, internationalism. And all of these were therefore skeptical towards institutions, but changing their values. And what our core argument in this book is, and it's a very large book, so you're very lucky to be here. So you don't need to read like 600 pages, you can just take the snapshot. Our core argument is that that was a liberal trend, which all of you in the room, I think, when I look around, lived through. I can't always say that to my students at Harvard who say, you know, who was Carter? Was somehow, whatever. Anyway, and that change as a generational shift really catalyzed the backlash and what we term the authoritarian reflex. Now, why? Well, I'll unpack that in just a minute. But if this argument is true, then we should be able to predict support for these parties by all the characteristics. Women should be more supportive than men, younger generations than old, college educated versus non-college educated, those in urban areas, those who are less religious, and by race and ethnicity, as well as by values. And this is the big model, which I know is a bit too much, but anyway, it just explains, this is the whole book in a snapshot. Social change happened in the 60s and 70s for all of these social groups. It created the silent revolution that has always been Practical Heart's work. And a silent revolution meant that our values changed, our culture changed dramatically, even though it was not something which was overt necessarily. That in itself has basically triggered the cultural backlash amongst the minority, amongst the traditionalists who believe that America of the 50s is no longer part of their America in 2024, who believe that there are all sorts of shifts which are going against their identities, which are going against their interests. And this is exacerbated by economic grievances and migration. That in turn leads to changes in vote seats, depending on the institutions. And that in turn leads to changes in how politics works. Liberal democracy, backsliding, human rights, civil rights, civic engagement, a whole bunch of other things can change as well. So what I'm saying in a nutshell is it's structural change, which we've all lived through, leads to cultural change, and that leads to a tipping point by those who feel that they're not part of the culture anymore. They were the majority in the 50s, they were the majority in the 60s. But as that group gradually leaves, partly through generational change, as that group essentially dies out through population changes, and the young generation becomes more middle-aged, so the whole culture changes. It's like a rat in a python. And that changes the nature of the culture. And for many, many years, it's a gradual process. And this is happening across Western countries, not just in America. Post-material values are expanding, material values are declining. And the conservatives still vote. Those who are part of the cultural backlash, often the older generation, are far more likely to vote than the younger generation, than all my students. I tell them, get out of bed, do go and vote. And they still say, oh, I forgot it was election day, or whatever it was. So this is at Harvard, right? This is the most engaged, this is at the Kennedy School, the most engaged political group. But by and large, turnout has an enormous difference. And therefore, as population changes, so the old majority becomes the new, just bare majority of the and a minority of the culture. And you thought that due to this, lots of things were changing around you, that climate change was real and was understood, and that women and men should have gender equality, and that was understood, and that there should be different respect for different types of sexuality, and there should be respect for diversity and migrations, and that should be welcome because it was culturally valuable. But instead of which, we find is that lots of those things are under threat because the cultural backlash has translated into power. And that is a situation which is changing lots of other aspects of our democracy. Now, I've got lots and lots and lots of evidence, as you might expect. I won't present it to you because it'll bore you silly, and I've got too many things which are like small tables and you won't understand them and they're too detailed, etc., etc. But I will say that if you want to look at details, this is when you buy the book. And the key findings, there you go in a snapshot. There are cleavages which are really important. Education is one of the predictors across every country of whether you're populist, an authoritarian populist, or whether you're not. Why? It's not because people are indoctrinated in school. It's not because they're being indoctrinated by college professors who are liberal. There's a little bit of that. But by and large, it's the whole process of going through education makes you more tolerant of other groups, makes you more knowledgeable about processes, makes you more trusting of other things. And therefore, ever since the 1950s, we know that the more educated are more liberal. Urbanization is a good predictor, as we know, the contrast between Paris and Marseille, the contrast between the north of England for Brexit and London. And cultural values like support for authoritarianism, social conservatism, predict parties in Europe and support for Trump. And the tipping point thesis is very difficult to prove because it's not about individuals, it's about society as a whole changing. But we live through it, we know what's happening there. And it's basically a cultural grievance, which is supporting the idea that we want a strong leader who can restore, quote unquote, make America great again. It's a nostalgic effect, make Britain great again, both countries which have lost empires. And there are other factors which are part of it and so on. Well, okay, just 2 slides more. Thank you for your patience. What are the consequences? Does this matter? And then we can come back and talk about my argument and whether or not it sounds plausible. No, I have a few more slides. Oh, sorry about that. Does it matter for democracy? Here's 4 leaders, all of whom are part of this ilk. Trump, obviously, with his prison photo. Bolsonaro in Brazil, who left. Orban, who's still in power, and Modi, who's still in power. All of these are authoritarian populist parties. What happens when they get to power? How does things change? Here you go. This is VDEM. This is liberal democracy as an index. And what you can do is you can say, when did they come to power? And what? And this, for example, is 2010, when Viktor Orban first gained a majority. He'd been in government for many years, but nevertheless, he gained an enormous majority. He was able to change the rules of the game. And then we saw a sharp decline in his first term, second term, third term, and fourth term, and continuing. And we see the same in India. This is Modi when he gets in around the same period. Goes down. In America, it's a temporary dip. It doesn't quite recover up to 2020, but nevertheless, there is a decline, a sharp decline. And in Brazil, it's slightly different. There's a decline which is much greater beforehand under Lula da Silva, then it kind of stabilizes. But by and large, the quality of liberal democracy goes down under these leaders, as does, in particular, freedom of expression and the media. And just look at those patterns. And again, it's not your first term in office. You're still learning the ropes. You don't know how to run things. You don't know how to change things. Your second term, your third term, your fourth term is when things get really, the level playing field becomes far more difficult for the opposition parties to make power. So Hungary, India, and again, here we see an improvement, but whether or not that continues to then go down after the Biden years, we'll see. And the same is true in particular elections. If your elections go down for all sorts of reasons, again, is a clean elections index from the Variety of Democracy Project, which is based in the University of Gothenburg, really good data. And you can see what happens. You manipulate the rules, and then the opposition can't really compete. There are elections. There is an opposition party or more parties. They can't win because the rules of the game don't allow a level playing field. And the same is true, as we can see, of changes in electoral integrity under Modi and under Trump. So the risks are real. And don't say because nothing much happened in the first, things were resilient. They were, but second term is going to be worse. That's a dreadful thing to send you all home with, rather depressing. How do you respond? Well, here's the explanation, the strategies that many parties will adopt. If you're on the liberal left, what do? If you're in the Democratic Party now, how do you respond to Trump? How do you get back into a more popular basis? Remember, it's only a small shift of the vote you need to do. So you can obviously mobilize. We did that. We were all in pink hats. Was anybody here in a pink hat? I was in a pink hat on Boston Common getting cold, as I remember. In fact, Nick was also on Boston Common, but not in a pink hat. And you make sure that you're effective as an electoral opposition, and you fight every election. You don't just allow some to go by default. But we know that that's also been the strategy under the first Trump term. It kind of worked because Biden came in, but it might not be enough. although we'll have to see how the courts work in conjunction with civil resistance. We could go for economic grievances and try to invest in those who are less well off, in those sectors of the communities who have found that they're losing jobs, who are losing people, who are losing factories. Also the Inflation Reduction Act, and also some of the early work he invested on infrastructure. Remember infrastructure? Trouble is, that takes an awful long time to have any impact. A lot of the money went to red states, but they either did not see the impact or they did not attribute it to or the Democrats. And so things will eventually improve, which is that work and don't fall down. We need to have all sorts of resilience in our economy. But, you know, it's not going to actually be the answer necessarily, particularly if economic inequality isn't the heart of the problem. And there are arguments about that. So you can wait. You can just say, well, you know, it's not so bad because eventually the social conservative older generations, the less educated, social trends are moving in a liberal direction. Just like Obama used to say, the arc of history points, you know, towards justice. But, you know, how many years are you going to wait? And how do you know that the institutions are going to be the same once you get out of it? So Poland, you know, they just had a change from an authoritarian populist party to Donald Tusk and a more moderate party. They've tried to restore the courts, very difficult. They've tried to restore some of the constitutional changes. They've tried to rebuild democracy in Poland, and it's been really tough. It's easier to break these things than it is to restore the legitimacy of these things. So we can wait, but, you know, hey, we're not going to see it in our lifetime, so there's a very depressing thing. And the last thing is my own potential solution. And I don't go into in detail in the book, but nevertheless, you have to respond to the cultural anxieties. If that's what's driving it, it's very, very difficult for liberal parties and for left parties to adopt to those ideas. Challenges to those values. But if you don't address them, like immigration policy, if you just say, as Biden seemed to have said, oh, it's a misinformation, it's Fox News, it's things people don't know anything about, and they won't believe it, it's not serious, and they only adapted at the very end. If you don't do more to adapt to people's real fears in every country which have had a high level of migration, then you're just whistling in the wind. You're never going to get popular support. If you don't address people's fears on a variety of other cultural issues, then again, how do you do that without giving up your values? Very difficult, especially because it's such a part of so many of the missions of these parties, so many of the core values of these parties. But I think you have to say Trump has, and these other parties have tapped into a genuine concern in the electorate, 50% of the voters in America. You can't say that they were all misinformed. They were all didn't know what they were doing. They were all ignorant. They voted for this party. They voted for this movement. They voted for these policies. How many times on the campaign trail did he say, I'm going to cut immigration, I'm going to, you know, throw people out the country in massive numbers and all sorts of other issues. I'm going to cut back on DEI. I'm going to cut back on transgender definitions in government and treatments, all of those things he said. And 50% voted for him. So the Democrats in the room have to say, how do you address that? What do you do? You can't just throw money at the problem. You can't just try and get industrial policy right. You've got to talk to people where they are in an election. And that's the heart searching, the soul searching, which I think the Democratic Party now has to do. They haven't figured it out. And I don't think they're anywhere close to figuring it out. They still, most of them still think this is the problem. I don't think it is. So that's my bit. Why don't we have any Q&A and other points and questions and comments you'd like to make, and we'll just whatever you like, and we've got some time. How long do we have now? I think we've got another half hour before we go to lunch.
Oh, I thought you had
15 minutes maybe.
Okay.
We've even got my watch. Oh my God.
Are there any remote questions?
Minutes. I did go on for a bit.
Okay.
Comments, criticisms. Say why I'm wrong.
Oh, I don't think you're wrong. Yeah. Let me put it a kind of a weird way. I think progressives are the problem. I think we progressives, about 100 years ago, we said, okay, the problem are the people that are in labor, particularly in manufacturing, are getting a raw deal. So we sent out those at that time sent out to solve that. Supported unions, supported OSHA, all good things, and we solved the problem. Okay, and then we said, okay, who's next? All right, and we said, well, the descendants of slaves are getting a bad deal. Women are getting a bad deal. Some immigrants are. So we started working on those, and we forgot the laborers. And there was a chart in the New York Times a few months ago showing that the current status, the economic of as you mentioned, educated people were going down. That of women and others were kind of stable. Well, actually, women are going up, and therefore, if you looked at it from the point of view of the non-college education person, that other people were getting a good deal, they're getting a bad deal from their point of view. Okay, even though the economy was doing well.
That's the economic explanation. But I'm saying that maybe there are other groups who have cultural resentments, cultural grievances, cultural feelings that they're not reflected in the culture anymore, that nobody respects their views.
Sure, but but then what these people saw, I think, was that, hey, the minorities are getting an advantage in college, admissions. Other people, in other words, there are people that are getting a good deal, much better than mine, and therefore I'm mad.
Yes.
Okay, and we progressives didn't do anything about that. We didn't really do a good job with retraining programs. We didn't do a good job with maybe even relocation programs if we could. That's tough.
Again, just to push back a fraction, that assumes that economic explanations are the heart of the cultural grievances. The cultural grievances are tied on because of the economic situation. And I'm saying the cultural grievances are there across the board of different income groups, different social sectors, different occupations. That I totally agree that blue-collar workers have not kept pace with the rate of cost of living, absolutely, and that they've got a bad deal in many ways. But I don't think that's the explanation. I don't think that's the solution. I don't think giving jobs programs, basically Sweden is doing nothing but jobs programs for everybody. I mean, they are the leading welfare state. The Netherlands is doing that. France has got creches. They have wonderful public services. Once you're 3, you just go to school and it's all free. Think about that if you want childcare in America. I mean, all of these are welfare states which are incredibly generous. They give very strong, because of the social democratic parties, very strong rights to workers. How many days a week do you work in France? What age are you when you get pensions? Precisely. I mean, improving welfare benefits to let the less well-off, I think, is absolutely important to my values. Is it going to solve this problem? No. And why is that? Because many of the groups who support MAGA and many of the support groups who support Republican Party are anti-government. They don't want the government to intervene. They certainly don't want the government to be spending lots of money on welfare programs, jobs programs, certainly schools and various other things, and healthcare, let alone. Even though they should, in their rational interest, they are anti-government, and that drives their sense that the solutions of the left, the progressives, aren't going to be the solutions that are going to stop them supporting Donald Trump.
Yeah, I would argue that expectations were set amongst that group of people, and now they're seeing there's a dissonance between their expectations and what's actually happening. And I think that's the reason for the dissatisfaction.
Right, but again, my evidence says it's not so much the economic dissatisfaction, it's the genuine fact that their views are becoming more minority views, that ideas about race have been transformed, and ideas about women have been transformed, and ideas about homosexuals and gays and LGBTQs have been transformed. And if you don't believe that, then you feel that the country is leaving you, that your country is not the country that you grew up in.
Well, I went to business school, so I have to take the economic.
Yes. I mean, there's lots of, the whole argument in the literature is all about economists versus political scientists and sociologists.
Wait, we're going to move on now. If you don't mind, we're going to move to these folks who have been online waiting to ask questions.
Please.
And okay, and some I think are repetitive, so I'm just going to select those that I think might have some merit. How do you account for the reluctance of the MAGA supporters to accept facts, and how do you explain?
Ah, magical realism, yeah.
Yeah.
And the next one?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. In the sort of in that theme, in the context of populism, I'm intrigued with what makes people vote for candidates who promote policies that will harm them and their families. Example, replacing the Affordable Care Act with concepts of a plan will undoubtedly lead to many people losing access to health care.
Yep. So the MAGA thing, the idea of people being misinformed and so on, and believing in magical realism is something which is very common in many of the parties and the followers that we see, and the growth of conspiracy theories. And again, it's the end of the Enlightenment, I'm afraid. If you don't believe in experts, and you don't believe in science, and you don't quite understand this climate stuff about water and things like that, then you basically take your messages and your cues from other things, your core values, your partisanship. Your partisanship is one of the strongest identifiers you have, and that will in turn lead to your views about these issues versus what goes on PBS, NPR, and all the other things, which is where many of us get our information from. But also it's true of everybody else as well, that everybody here gets their information from certain information sources you trust and certain information sources which give you a certain perspective. And maybe there should be some reasons to be skeptical, for example, about the COVID treatments, which were put forward by many countries, or by many other scientific things from medical information that changes overnight, it appears, from one thing to another. So some skepticism, I always argue, is, but of course, if it throw out knowledge and information, and if you don't really understand it, too distant. And particularly if you haven't gone to a college education, and it all seems like it's just kind of mumbo jumbo, and the scientists don't really talk to the public in direct ways, in ways which they understand what is science or what is education, then of course you attack it. And you're not one of it. You don't believe you're part of it. You don't believe you could ever get into Harvard or into any of the other Ivies. So why would you support them? Why do you believe them? Why do you think these elites are credible? And we all have our flaws. We all have our blinders. We just believe in different things, different realities, and that's a real problem.
We have a date over at Alberto's, and you and Dr. Norris will be there, and I hope you can, and you'd be willing to between courses answer some questions, Dr. Norris.
You can also put all this stuff available for anybody on any website, so you can just download it, and then you can, because I went through it very fast. If you want to look at the little prints and anything else, and the technical footnotes and so on, or you can buy the book.
Thank you so much. Pippa, this was exceptional, but you've given us all reason for a glass of wine. So this is the
Very
vehicle
kind.
to deliver that.
Thank you
So
so
let's
much. That's very
thank you
kind.
very much.
Thank you.
So so those